transgender, students of color activists. So land acknowledgement. I am in a Zoom video presenting today from the ancestral and ceded lands of the Nimipu peoples. I am learning and I'm doing my best to honor Indigenous communities, knowledges, and more. I understand land acknowledgements are not enough, and more should be done to learn from and center the leadership of Indigenous and non-centered peoples. Access needs. I want to honor and respect all of our diverse body minds. During my presentation, please feel free to take care of your own access needs. Feel free to move around, stretch, fidget, stim, wander, use the restroom, take a break, take a nap, drink some water, eat some food, and anything you need to do to take care of your body mind. Please feel free to message us in the chat for any collective access needs you are seeking, and we will do our best to meet your needs. Additionally, please feel free to type in your questions within the chat, and I will answer your questions at the end of my presentation. This presentation is recorded and available for public viewing after this event. Image descriptions. I am a gender fluid Filipinx person with light brown skin, dark brown eyes, and straight black shoulder length hair. I use any pronoun ranging from he, she, they. I appreciate it the most when others honor my fluidity and alternate calling me Dr. Paul, Lena, and or Paulina. About me. I'm first generation, gender fluid, queer, diasporic Filipinx, scholar, activist, educator. I have 8 years of intersectional and critical higher education teaching. I've taught disability studies, women's gender sexuality studies, teaching and learning, multicultural leadership, academic success. I have over 15 years of higher education leadership and activism. I've worked at University of California, Santa Barbara's Multicultural Center, Santa Barbara County Action Network, a social and economic environmental justice nonprofit, Washington State University's Multicultural Student Services, WSU's Access and Opportunity Food Pantry, WSU's First Scholars, and University of Washington Bothel's Academic Success Coaching. My Filipinx family resisted Spanish colonial violence. That is why I write, teach, lead, and organize and rest. Unfortunately, as well and systemically, my Filipinx family has resisted US colonial violence and survived imperialistic wars such as World War II. My trans, queer, and woman of color ancestors were fed to the crocodiles. We are all still here alive and resisting today. My parents, both were professionals in the Philippines, but when migrating to the US, worked low wage and precarious jobs. We grew up with tremendous anti-Asian racism, from racial slurs to our home graffitied. I did not see my whole self in communities and my ancestors during my K-12 and higher education experience. Rarely do I see our institutions center and support first generation, low income, transgender, queer, disabled, and Filipinx people and our communities, stories, histories, dreams, and futures. Why I write, next slide. Why I wrote this chapter. I am now 33 years young and have been holding 33 years of intersectional counter-narrative stories of me and the people I love experiencing institutional, widespread, and systemic barriers. From my parents sharing with me how their supervisors and coworkers talked down at them and treated them as less, from me feeling that way, from my students feeling that way, To more non-centered faculty and staff I know feeling that way, I am tired. I'm tired of continuously fighting for my and our worthiness to access joy, care, rest, community. Our feelings of despair, frustration, and more are not isolated when they are collective and systemic, rooted in our shared histories and interconnected communities. An introduction to my research and book chapter. According to Ahmed, knowledge is bound up with what makes us sweat, shudder, tremble. All those feelings are crucially felt on our bodily surface, the skin surface where we touch and we're touched by the world. Drawing from queer critical race feminist theory and through qualitative research observations, interviews, and focus groups, this study highlights the emotional experiences of queer and transgender student of color activists at a higher education institutions and offers multiple recommendations to addressing the everyday struggles queer and transgender students of color face. My theoretical framework is queer critical race feminist theory, drawing from women of color, feminism, and queer of color scholars. Women of color feminists center interconnected, inseparable, multiple, and fluid experiences of women of color, queer women of color, and those facing multiple forms of oppression and marginalization. Queer of color scholars challenge queer theory, which often minimizes the multiple systemic struggles queer and transgender people of color encounter. Affective emotions are centered to challenge the multiple forms of historical and systemic discriminations. My methodology consists of emotional themes found within my qualitative observations, interviews, and focus groups. Ahmed 2010 discusses the ways in which emotions are sticky and become stuck. Certain emotions are associated with and oriented towards certain groups of people, items, and spaces because these emotions have been produced and reproduced over time. Emotions are not individual. Since emotions are effective responses to certain situations, I utilize queer feminist of color theory to analyze these collective emotional experiences. I found these key themes, and please content note, I am discussing systemic violence in this presentation around depression and anxiety, stereotypes and isolation, invisibility and hypervisibility, frustration and the lack of intersectionality. And I have also found among my participants, they move from shame to pride, feelings of survival and healing, resistance, demanding justice and self-love and care, and more than just self-love and care, a community of care, a community of support and mentorship. So the first theme I found is depression and anxiety. Participant 1, a self-identified working class undocumented and queer, Chicano, expressed the ways in which he and others around him constantly doubt his abilities to be a successful student in higher education. He deals with these external and then internalized deficit messages rooted in discrimination towards his Chicano Latino communities. The predominantly white students he tutors question his abilities to teach the English language because of his accent and his skin color. When applying for graduate school, participant 1 doubts any institution will accept him, but refuses to be defeated. He states, "Right now, I'm in the process of applying for grad programs. I think there is no way I'm getting accepted. Who am I? Who am I, this person who speaks English with an accent? This person that went to a school where scores are really low? How dare this person be in academia?" And it's more like you have to go back and be like, do I really belong here? And stop asking questions. No, I do belong. Depression and anxiety continued. Participant 2, a self-identified working to middle-class multiracial, Black, Cuban, queer, and gender fluid person of color, shared the ways in which they were bullied when they were young. They were often teased about their physical appearance, race, and hair. During the beginning of college, they felt the need to dress overly feminine to hide their sexuality and gender identities. Although participant 2 is now out and proud of their race, gender, sexuality, and class identities, they constantly struggle with internalized messages of self-hate, depression, anxiety. They share, lately I've been crying until I can't cry anymore. There's a pain. It feels like I'm getting stabbed in the heart with a knife at the tip of my heart. It hurts so much where I can feel the knife in my back. That's how much it hurts. Participant 3, an Asian American lesbian woman, highlights the ways in which mental health is a huge issue for queers, people of color, and queer people of color. She emphasizes the importance of reaching out and being there for one another, because many people, especially queer people of color who deal with multiple forms of discrimination, silently struggle by themselves. She says, I want people to find different alternatives to cope with their feelings, even if it's just talking to someone or going for a run or listening to music. They feel like they don't matter or something, and they do. They think that when they die, it doesn't stop the world, but it does stop the world for so many people. Participant 4, a self-identified multiracial Black, Chinese, queer woman, feminist, womanist, and person of faith, acknowledges mental health is a constant struggle she deals with. As a first-generation student struggling to pay the bills, assist her family, and make her family proud of her academic and career accomplishments. Along with worrying about finances and meeting expectations of her family, she battles with constant anxieties of disappointing others around her merely for being who she is, a radical, multiracial, queer Black woman with opinions and no tolerance of any form of disrespect. She deals with the anxiety of re-experiencing microaggressions directed at her race, gender, sexuality, class, and faith. She shares, I'm worried somehow, somewhere, I've offended someone, or they are reevaluating our relationship. So that is something that makes me uncomfortable. I've been very uncomfortable within groups of people who make jokes that are racist or microaggressions towards me that makes me uncomfortable, but that is everyday life. Participant 5, a self-identified multiracial Black, bisexual woman, shares her story of attempting suicide exactly a year ago on the day I interviewed her. She discusses ways in which she is feeling stronger and more connected today after surrounding herself with African American and queer communities that support all of her identities, experiences, and aspirations. She is less isolated and purposely seeks to get involved in Black and queer student organizations. She aims to reach out to others who may be feeling hopeless, like she felt a year ago. She says, a year ago, I was so depressed because I ran away from my mom, and then my girlfriend and I broke up. It was like boom, boom. And so I felt I went from having everyone to having no one. I was very lonely and all of the normal signs and symptoms of depression. So I was wanting the pain to be over. Invisibility and hypervisibility. Participant 2 conveys how she's often the only Black woman in her classes. She intentionally sits near the front of her class to make sure her opinions are heard by her professor and classmates. She speaks of the multiple ways in which Black women are either invisible in the classroom or hypervisible, as angry, nurturing, or hypersexualized. Although her father speaks of and asks questions regarding her boyfriends, her previous and current girlfriends are often unspoken of or referred to as friends. Those she is dating often make assumptions of her sexuality and misidentify her. The sexuality she identifies with is rarely embraced in its entirety. They see me as straight or they see me as gay. They see me as one or the other. Especially when I'm talking to a girl, they think I'm gay. If I'm dating a guy, they think I'm straight. If I'm dating a guy or girl, I'm still bisexual. Invisibility and hyper-invisibility continued. Before participant 3 presented herself with a masculine haircut and clothes, she noticed an alarming number of people were unaware of her queer identity. Oh my goodness, y'all. I hope you can see my screen. Her sexuality was unseen when Asian American women are often stereotyped to be model minority, silent, and submissive women who cannot be queer, according to Shaw in 1997. Now that she presents herself as masculine, her Asian American and identity and sexuality become hypervisible, tokenized, and exotified. If her identities are not praised, they are put down and looked down upon. She states, I think personally for me, because I'm Asian and stuff, everyone here has been like, oh my God, it's so rare to see a gay Asian person, especially for a girl type of thing. And they are super fascinated and ask me all sorts of questions. I totally don't mind, but there are people like, you are a disgrace to your family. Participant 1 often finds himself to be the one brown face in a sea of majority white faces, or one queer among many heteronormative presenting people. His brown skin is invisible when few validate his intellect and worth. His brown skin is hypervisible when anti-immigrant racist tropes circulate. His queer identity is often hypervisible among homophobic people of color spaces, not authentic enough in queer spaces. He says, going to LGBTQ spaces where you are too brown to go in there, people look at you different. You're one of the few people speaking your language and others dismissing you. Not feeling good enough and going to spaces of color knowing you are the queer one. Frustration with the lack of intersectionality. Participant 1 expresses his frustration on campus, especially among predominantly white queer groups that do not practice intersectionality in terms of embracing multiple fluid race, gender, sexuality, disability, and class identities and issues. He reveals how he is disappointed with LGBTQ groups silencing these issues. He shares, some of the women of color organizations are even better than our LGBT white groups. Recently, a women of color organization did a tabling event remembering trans women of color who have been killed, whereas our LGBTQ folk were celebrating their Pride Week and their coming out events. So I really appreciate the intersectional approach taken by other groups. Participant 5 urges Black Lives Matter activists to not only focus on Black male lives, but also Black women, along with trans and queer Black women. They urge their Black community to accept all Black identities. They say, if we want to build our community up, we cannot forget the Black and trans queer people of color. It's like saying Black Lives Matter, but queers don't. You can't do that. You're not down for Black lives if you're not down for all Black lives. So some hope. I also found themes of shame to pride among my 5 participants. Participant 1 finds pride in the writings of queer people of color. He says, I came to this country at 10 and they made me take standardized tests after 6 months of being here, and I failed them, all of them, because obviously I didn't know English, and I also started hating my accent. After reading these works by queer people of color, I started seeing people like myself being published, and it's something I can relate to. It helped me. It helped me feel proud of the places I come from and not feel the shame that school systems have made me feel. I also found a theme of survival and healing. Participant 4 specifically speaks to an Indigenous and queer of color-led poetry event as a healing event. She shares, a system was created to decimate who they are, where they come from, and take everything that belongs to them rightfully. And to have these people go up there and unapologetic and to share that with us, it was such a beautiful and healing event. Survival and healing continued. Participant 3 speaks of an all queer people of color panel with an audience of majority white queers. She describes this event as empowering to her because majority white queer student groups rarely feature queer people of color speakers and events. She says, I thought that was a victory because everyone there was so focused and wanting to learn. It was like them being taught and they were taking down notes, and it was so awesome to see. Resistance. Feelings of resistance stirred among my participants during our focus group who refused systemic marginalization. According to participant 1, resistance comes in the form of coming together as collective communities. I think uniting, like right now in this room, all queer people of color, that never happens. I mean, it does, but at our higher education institution, it rarely happens, but it does happen. Participant 4 envisions resistance as everyday survival. Women of color feminists illustrate the ways in which existence is a form of resistance in a world that doesn't want them to love themselves, according to Lord 1984 and Martinez 2014. They share, you existing is an important form of resilience and healing. You existing in those spaces, that might not have initially or automatically include you as whole. You saying, this is all of me, and I will be healing for that community, for that space itself. Demanding justice. The participants said, mandated cultural competence for directors of gender and sexuality centers, bringing in people of color and queer people of color into these spaces, having a queer person of color speaking series. And then also they advocated for, I think it would be cool if the university gives funding for queers of color to go to conferences, fund our research, fund our communities, instead of spending so much money on football. How about you fund your college students to do research? My and our future work, rest, and joy. So this, thanks y'all for listening to this project. I think I'm missing a slide because I had another slide, but now I can't find it. But anywho, I just wanted to share, thank you so much. Like, this is all very heavy. And, the research, the work is out there, right? For our diversity, equity, and inclusion teams on our universities to implement. So my personal future work, rest, and joy consists of continuing to learn from sick and disabled, trans, queer, Black, Indigenous, people of color students, staff, and faculty who resist these higher ed and K-12 barriers. I also seek to continue learning from my intersectional Filipinx social justice community and how we're engaging in decolonial activisms in solidarity with non-centered people. I also seek to continue learning directly from Disability Justice, co-founded by sick and disabled trans queer people of color, and also how all of our learning spaces, especially youth popular culture spaces, such as animated storytelling and video games, are creating alternative worlds of rest and joy. And I will continue to take care of myself through joy and rest with my access puppy Milo, and also creating my utopic dream world within my Studio Ghibli, Sanrio, and puppy themed ACNH island. Oh, here's my missing slide. So sorry, y'all. So, right, it's all messy. So demands to support our communities. I hope we can honor our interconnected, multiple fluid, complex identities, especially those of us that are sick and disabled. K-12 and higher education, queer of color led critical education services and curriculums, along with recruiting, training, and equitable wage paying non-centered leaders, faculty, staff, and students. And above all, I do believe that our demand to really support our trans, queer, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities sick, and disabled communities is to have an accessible, affordable, and quality food, housing, critical education, and supportive academic, student, and community services for all of us, and also having access to quality jobs. And if we can't work, having access to rest, joy, and more. So thank y'all. Thank you. Maraming salamat. Many thanks for allowing me to share and learn more with you more today. Thank you to UW Bothell Diversity Center and UW Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services for co-sponsoring ASL and CART. Comments and questions are welcome in the chat, and I'm wondering if Mario can assist in asking those questions. Thank you very much. And everyone, please keep in touch. And I hope to continue dialoguing with you and building community with you. With love, care, and respect, Dr. Paulina Abustan, and my email is pabustan@uw.edu. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you. If you can join me in a virtual round of applause, use reactions, join the chat, or if your video is on. Thank you, Dr. Paulina. I will be open to questions. I'll actually be checking the chat. So there's a lot of thank yous, thank you, thank yous, thank you. So we have about 6 minutes. If you all have any questions, you could put them in the chat. You can also, I know you're all muted. So I wonder if I can also, oh, actually, no, there's 54 people. I was gonna say, just raise your hand reaction and I can call on you as well. So we have multiple ways of asking questions. Thank you, many thank yous. Any questions? I'm scrolling to see if we have any hands raised, but nothing yet. So thank you. I was struck by 2 statements, the knife in the heart and the description of real physical pain. More thank yous. And if you do want to read the chapter in the Queer People of Color in Higher Ed book, it would be chapter 3 as well. So Dr. Paul, thank you for your time and energy and sharing, including everyone's lived experiences in a powerful way to decenter one voice, one truth.
I see a question from Dr. Cinnamon Hilliard, and they say, thank you, Dr. Paulina. If you were to make one recommendation to college leaders based on your research, what would it be? And that's a tough one because there's so many, and there needs to be so many various systemic changes, but really following and honoring the collective emotional experiences of my participants. I would say, number one, having trans, queer, Black, Indigenous people of color throughout the university as leaders who are critically trained to support trans, queer, of color students and to advocate for more funding, whether it's for diversity centers or queer studies or critical race studies, more funding for people already doing the work, and also more funding, right, to encourage trans, queer, people of color themselves to do research within their own communities. And so that's my biggest number one recommendation coming from my participants, inspired by my participants. And the second one is to ensure the university as itself is affordable and accessible. So that means, looking at tuition, looking at who we're recruiting, how are we retaining them? And we do this important work at Bothell with academic success coaching, but also really looking at, do our students staff and faculty have access to equitable pay and equitable wages? And do they have food? Do they have housing, quality food and housing, and supports to help us stay here in this very predominantly white space, predominantly heteronormative space? So all that we can do, to provide those multiple supports. And it can even be as simple as, within your own staff, recognizing those students you work with, those staff, those faculty, and ensuring they have their basic needs met. But really imagining that world where we can lead. And this also comes from disability justice, disability justice co-founded by Byrne et al. Trans, queer people of color who are sick and disabled really, should be leading our spaces, as we are at the axes of all these multiple systemic forms of discrimination. So for example, this event here, I was maybe the only one person really advocating for American Sign Language and CART. And why am I the only one really advocating for this, right? And we're missing that right now. We are not accessible right now. And there's a lot going on, but one ASL part or one ASL person was missing, and the ASL interpreter, I feel so sorry for them. They should have a break, but this happens everywhere in so many spaces. Trans, queer, people of color who are sick and disabled, once again, are at the margins of the margins. And so if we truly listen to those who are at experiencing multiple oppressions, we can best learn how to lead.
All right, so we're out of time, but if you want to touch on it, this question real quick, what's your recommendation for white heteronormative colleagues for supporting students, especially in campus recreation environments?
My biggest recommendation to you all is to follow the collective emotional experiences of my participants and really listen to trans, queer, people of color, sick and disabled, trans, queer, people of color. When you're in these spaces, try not to talk a lot, right? Because we're already living in a world that is predominantly white, predominantly violent to our body minds. So when you're in these spaces, really take time to listen to those that often aren't given the mic, aren't given the platform, and already, educate yourself. All the research, the activism is out there, and to learn directly from that. And also don't ask them to educate you because the activism and education, once again, the research is out there. But when they are speaking, when they are sharing, when they are, really taking to heart what they are sharing with you and looking at the collective, going to people, organizations already doing the work.
Thank you very much. So that concludes our second session. We will have 5 minutes to transition into session 3. So you will see that in your program booklet, but thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for that amazing presentation. So we have session 3, then we have closing and our mixer. So thank you everybody and have a great day. And thank you so much for our captionists for capturing the presentation as well. And this is recorded, so I will stop recording now. And then in the chat, I believe we also have the presentation that's accessible, right, Paulina?
Yes.
Let's see. I'm sorting through my emails to try to find it right now, but we'll put it in the chat.
Thank you all. Maraming salamat.
Bye, everyone.
Please take care of yourself. Take some breaks. Drink some water.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.